Well, hi everyone and welcome. I'm Sarah Wood, Director of the Ethical Advisors Cooperative. And on behalf of the Co-op, I thank you all for joining us for this Ethical Investment Week 2021 event, Wayfinding and Ethical Investment. I acknowledge that I am hosting this online seminar from the lands of the Gumbaynggirr people. And I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you all walk today and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this event. I'd like to welcome all attendees from across New Zealand, Australia and further afield. Now in its 8th year, Ethical Investment Week highlights the objectives and benefits of ethical investments and is coordinated by the Ethical Advisors Co-op. The cooperative was established by a dedicated group of financial advisors who recognised the need to represent and advocate on behalf of ethical and responsible investment advice. The cooperative has grown to a membership of 31 advisors, all of whom operate within ethically focused financial planning practices around Australia and New Zealand. Collectively, we manage over $2 billion of ethical investors' money, currently assisting over 3,300 investors to make the best of their financial position while pursuing ethical outcomes. Their advice continues to assist clients to achieve strong, sustainable returns while encouraging the responsible allocation of capital within global markets. So Dr. Roger Spiller is our first New Zealand-based co-op member, and we are thrilled to have him on board and to have his and Professor Shelley Spiller's expertise about wayfinding and ethical investment to share with us all tonight. So our format today is that following introductions, Roger and Shelley will present for about 45 minutes. There will then be time for questions before we conclude in about an hour from now. So Roger and Shelley will stay on Zoom for hopefully another 10 or 15 minutes after the formal close, just to answer any further questions that you might have. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to use the Zoom chat section. We're going to collate that as we go and hopefully get to as many as possible at the end of the presentation. So just before we do commence the presentation, I do just want to note that anything covered during the session today is not regulated financial advice. So this just means the session is for education purposes only. You'll see this in the disclaimer here on this slide. So we also encourage you to learn more about Money Matters and Roger on the Money Matters website, which you can see there on the screen. So joining us today to introduce our speakers and to manage our Q&A session is Rachel Alambakis. She's Managing Editor of FS Sustainability, who the Co-op is thrilled to have as our official media partner for Ethical Investment Week. So thank you, Rachel, and over to you.
Thanks, Sarah, and good evening, everybody. It's such a pleasure to join you tonight. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I join you all here from the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional custodians of the land where I live, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. FS Sustainability is so pleased to be involved with this event. We deliver news and thought leadership on ESG issues regarding Australian companies and investors, from the institutional to the retail. Our publication's unique in-depth writing covers how investable Australian companies manage, disclose, and communicate their ESG risks and opportunities. I established the publication, now known as FS Sustainability, back in 2011, and I joined Rainmaker Information in 2019, where we relaunched the title to align it with the financial standard. For more information and to subscribe to our free weekly newsletter, which goes out every Friday at 8 a.m., please go to www.fssustainability.com.au. With that plug in, it is my pleasure to introduce our speakers for today. Professor Shelley Spiller is of Maori and European lineage and has a passion for researching and sharing the wisdom of Indigenous people and how it can provide unique insights for creating sustainable well-being and wealth. She is a prolific and widely cited academic author and co-author of the highly popular Wayfinding Leadership. Her TED Talk on the subject has been viewed over 20,000 times. Shelley is a leadership development trainer in high demand locally and internationally. Professor Spiller is married to Dr. Roger Spiller, and for close to 20 years, she's played an important research and support role for Roger's ethical investment advisory business. Roger has been a passionate pioneer of ethical investment since the beginning of the industry in Australia and New Zealand in the 1980s. He founded his ethical investment advisory, Money Matters, in 1990. With a PhD in ethical investment and ethical business and many academic and popular publications, Roger has held many influential leadership roles, ranging from being a former member of the Securities Commission to bringing the Responsible Investment Association Australasia to New Zealand, and now the Ethical Advisors Co-op. Recently named New Zealand's inaugural Best Ethical Advisor, he's been described as being the father of ethical investing in New Zealand. With that, over to you, Dr. and Professor Spiller.
Kia ora koutou. Apologies, we're having technical issues here, so you won't be able to see our faces. You'll just have to imagine what we look like if you have never met us before. But I think it's very appropriate that we have a picture of a waka that's speaking for us, and I'll be sharing slides shortly, so we'll move through the technical hazards. But first, e ngā mana, e ngā rau, e ngā hau e whā, tēnā koutou. Ngā mihi mahana ki a koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui ki a koe. Warm Pacific greetings to each of you. We welcome the peoples of the four winds to this time together, and we welcome your ancestors. I acknowledge the land upon which Roger and I stand, and the peoples of Ngāti Whātua Ōrākei.
Kia ora, hi everyone, and thank you all very much for joining us on this journey tonight. Welcome aboard. A special thanks to Shelley for being part of Ethical Investment Week and to the Ethical Advisors Co-op for this opportunity to explore wayfinding for ethical investment.
Today's wayfinders are the living face of Indigenous wisdom that has been orally transmitted from one generation to the next through millennia. For thousands of years, wayfinders have observed the natural world, worked out their location and destination, set a course to get there, and then responded to signs along the way. Wayfinders who continue to practice their ancient craft in cultural pockets around the world include the Australian Aboriginals who track the desert, Bedouin nomads who traverse the sand dunes, the Inuit who read the snow, and Polynesian navigators who navigate the oceans. Wayfinders go beyond the known. They take journeys of discovery to new horizons. The principles of wayfinding have developed through action and practice in deep intimacy with an ever-changing world. It's a human story of journeying through life sustainably, collectively, equitably, and respectfully. It's as much about the journey as it is about reaching the destination. Wayfinding is as relevant for our times as it has been throughout history. By drawing upon ancient wisdom, modern wayfinders hold insights that can make a big difference for ethical investors and business. Because we are each being called to be wayfinders of today in our lives as we travel through the unknown and difficult waters of COVID and face a world with massive environmental and social issues. And this can invoke fear. However, each of us is the descendant of wayfinders somewhere in our history, brave men and women who went on journeys of discovery in search of a better life for themselves and their descendants. Each generation has had to deal with the unknown and uncertainty, from Scottish Highlanders, the Irish, Vortrekkers, Sikhs, Māori. We have this knowledge deep within our DNA. For some cultures, this has been their continuous way of life. For others, there has been a severance, but we can all learn from the wayfinders. In researching wayfinding, I have been honoured to work with Hoturoa Barclay Kerr, pictured here on my right, captain of the ocean-going vessel Haunui. Māori describe these boats as waka, which is the term I'll use today. And I have also been fortunate to work with John Panaho, pictured on my left, a Māori entrepreneur who named his business Navigator Tours, and that was part of my PhD studies. Together, John, Hutu, and I co-authored the book Wayfinding Leadership. I'll draw from that book today and from my leadership development programs. But first, when introducing ourselves, Māori often trace our relationship through layers of connectedness, citing our lineage, which illuminates the fullness of a person through relationships. My ancestry dates back to Tahu Pōtaki, symbolised by the image on the left. Also shown here are my great-grandmother and great-grandfather, my grandmother and my mother, in tribal meeting grounds on the east coast of New Zealand's North Island. But I also acknowledge my European lineage. Pictured here is my father with his mother, then his father, and there our family outside a church where my father was a minister, and that's me on the left. So when I first met Roger, he had recently finished his PhD. Sorry, I'm just going to get these slides working. I've got a bit of a technology, we've got a gremlin in our slides here. When I first met Roger, he had recently finished his PhD as I was doing my master's. He encouraged me to undertake a PhD at the same business faculty at the University of Auckland that he had, which I concluded in 2010. And this slide shows an article based on my PhD with a title that summarised my research and is part of what I will share today about relational wellbeing and wealth, and for Māori, how the relational dimension of life is fundamental to creating wellbeing and wealth, which is the purpose of business and life, and is guided by principles such as an ethic of care. This slide also shows an article based on Roger's PhD, which was published in the same academic journal, but 10 years earlier. This huge growth of interest in ethical business and ethical investment can be seen by the large increase in numbers of people reading and referencing Roger's article. So Roger and I are committed to having our research insights available in practical applied contexts. We've been described as practical academics or pracademics, and I'm happy that we have woven our research insights together for today's presentation in the very practical realm, applying this to investment. So our aim is to present both philosophical wisdom and practical applications of that wisdom to add to what you already know about ethical investment. So Roger will now relate wayfinding to ethical investment.
My PhD back 25 years ago used the journeying analogy, explaining how ethical investors and ethical businesses that those investors regarded most highly were on a journey in uncharted waters, discovering new ways of investing and doing business as their explorations took them further and further. This journey is continuing, and you are playing or can play an important role. Back then, I wrote that ethical investors were calling for a new paradigm of business that moved from the primary concern of business being short-term profit maximization to taking a longer view, creating environmental, social, and economic wealth, and a wider approach that took account of all stakeholders. And I tackled the philosophical and financial objections as well, before creating a model, the 4 Ps of ethical business. And in keeping with the wayfinding approach, we'll use the 4 Ps, purpose, principles, practices, and performance measurement from my PhD model as reference points or waypoints to help us navigate this presentation, as they provide a framework for exploring ethical investment in business. We'll consider how wayfinding can add new insights about the purpose of the ethical investment journey, illustrate principles that can guide our journey, offer practices to implement, and new insights to performance measurement. Now, bringing wayfinding philosophy and practices to ethical investment can help the investment journey in a range of ways. Firstly, reducing risk. The first rule for most investors is return of your investment. Wayfinding wisdom can help avoid disasters that could result in you losing your investment. Secondly, it increases returns by adding impact. Now, most investors, including most ethical investors, aim to achieve a good financial return on their investment. Ethical investors aim to also have a positive environmental and social impact. Wayfinding wisdom broadens the idea of impact to include spiritual and cultural dimensions not usually considered by ethical investors. And thirdly, we can explore having a more fulfilling journey. The wayfinding perspective is that the true gift of wayfinding is not arrival at a destination, it's who we become along the way. Wayfinding shows ways that investors can experience more personal development and fulfillment through the investment journey. Now, I've always found the analogy of sailing and navigating helpful in providing useful insights for investors. Indeed, back in 2000, shortly before I met Shelley, I authored the Essential Guide to Financial Planning in New Zealand, which has this cover referring to navigation. I've adapted the 4 Ps to explain this and complete our setting of the scene tonight. So planning your life journey and money matters is like going on a major sailing expedition, and it pays to have an astute, expert, trustworthy navigator in the form of a specialist ethical investment advisor who can help you clarify your purpose, which is your destination, apply time-tested principles, these are your values, and practices to guide you and create a great plan, that's the course, mapped out, and the chosen portfolio, that's your boat. Guided by an expert, trustworthy advisor, the navigator, you can have peace of mind, and the journey itself will be less stressful and more fulfilling than trying to make the journey without this guidance. Now, the need for more people to make the journey from conventional to ethical investment is being highlighted currently in the lead up to the 2021 United Nations Climate Change Conference, COP26, starting later this week. They're looking for solutions for massive problems such as climate change, poverty, hunger, and human rights. And there are calls for much more investment and engagement from business. Indigenous wisdom, as we see in the wayfinding approach, offers unique insights in helping address the world's global environmental and social crises. This fact has been recognised in a report from the New Zealand Sustainable Finance Forum that brought together leaders to produce a roadmap for action to finance a sustainable future, and that I was honoured to be part of creating. Similar initiatives have happened in Australia and other countries around the world. The New Zealand roadmap included input from Maori leaders, including Shelley, and has the Maori concept of well-being as its defined purpose. The forum identified that the first step on the sustainability journey is changing mindsets as a prerequisite to the other steps of transforming the financial system and financing the transformation. Changing mindsets is a huge problem and a challenge to which Shelley's wayfinding research and insights provide a unique, effective, and clearly timely solution.
So let's explore our first P of purpose. The Indigenous response to the crisis of sustainability includes challenging investors and business to have a purpose based on creating what I describe as the 5 well-beings. That's economic, social, environmental, cultural, and spiritual well-being. And this is depicted in my 5 well-beings model. The numbers represent business practices that can increase each well-being, with the shades representing an example of a business. Shown at the centre of my model is the starting point for any wayfinding journey, which is the spiritual dimension, described by Māori as io, the coalescence of spiritual connectedness for all of creation. Adding cultural and spiritual to the usual ethical investment considerations of environmental, social, and economic broadens, deepens, and can add tremendous value to the ethical investment journey and to the challenge of changing mindsets. The 5 well-beings describe what Māori call te ao marama, a concept relating to wisdom and understanding in the natural world of life and light. It derives from the Māori legend in which Tāne, Māori guardian of the forest and birds, separated his sky father Ranginui and earth mother Papatuanupu to create a world of light. Wayfinding wisdom invites us to define the purpose for our lives and our investments as creating a world of more light. The difference between my model of Māori business and business as usual. Business as usual focuses on making money, not making a difference. The emphasis is on individual self-interest rather than the collective. In the current generation rather than the future generations, profit is an end in itself rather than a means to an end. Profit maximization is the focus rather than value creation, and economic growth does not consider environmental limits. So to help explain the transformational shift that can occur when we add a new dimension to our purpose and experience a change in mindset, I will use the example of Abbott's Flatland, written in 1884 as a critique of the stultifying conditions of Victorian England. Flatland is a society of creatures who inhabit a two-dimensional surface. These inhabitants, including the central character, a square, can't conceive of worlds beyond their two-dimensional experience. But one day, a sphere enters Flatland and invites the square to consider the possibility of multiple dimensions. But because it's a two-dimensional world, the square can't properly recognize the sphere, nor understand what he's asking. The square sees the sphere just as a circle with no interior or depth. Eventually, the sphere casts the square out of Flatland into a three-dimensional world. Owing to his experience beyond Flatland, the square sees things differently. He undergoes a transformation of consciousness. He can now see and understand that his worldview was based on a reality he knew as a two-dimensional surface that was narrow and limited, and he returns to Flatland with a different perspective. So Flatland represents the profit-dominated marketplace, governed by investment and business, as usual, in which the emphasis is typically on economic growth. An inhabitant of Flatland is a two-dimensional person, depicted as a square, and I'm using them as a representation of a two-dimensional investor, focused solely on the pursuit of material wealth, with their investments disconnected from their heart and soul, and disconnected from others and nature. Ethical investment offers a three-dimensional approach in which we get out of the box and adopt the rounded perspective of the sphere, to see ourselves and to fully recognize others, to see how we co-constitute our world, and to be willing to see how our actions, including our investments, affect others. Beyond Flatland, there has been a transformation of consciousness, a change in mindset. People are kaitiaki, caretakers of each other and of place. They are spheres, not squares, seeking to create more light and encouraging the funds and businesses in which they invest to strengthen efforts to find the way to a sustainable future. The wayfinding journey from square to sphere and becoming more enlightened includes journeying within. Wayfinders are voyagers of innerscapes as well as outerscapes. The experience of great explorers is epitomised in the words of famous New Zealander Mount Everest climber Sir Edmund Hillary, who said, "It's not the mountain we must conquer, but ourselves." The idea of journeying within and seeking enlightenment might sound strange in the context of investment in business. However, all leaders have been willing to take the inner journey to know themselves and to keep on with this never-ending journey. As Parker Palmer, the educationalist and author of Courage to Lead, reminds us, all great wisdom traditions say that if you go far enough on the inner journey, go past ego towards true self, you end up not lost in narcissism, but returning to the world, bearing more gracefully the responsibilities that come with being human. So wayfinders such as Hotu highlight that everyone on the waka will invariably come up against themselves at some point in the journey. Even if we don't know ourselves well and see with clarity the ways in which we get caught up in our habitual way of engaging with others, then we aren't going to have good relationships, wise decision-making, or a pleasant journey. As Hotu said, we go through life thinking that the world needs to adjust, other people need to adjust. We don't think it's us who needs to adjust. And yet this waka is our life. When we adjust, our life does for the better. The rudder, the hoi, is the embodiment of who am I. I've seen people come on journeys who haven't been able to adjust themselves. They get off the waka exactly the same as they got on. They get on the waka thinking they're going to change others, yet the only influence they had was that people wanted them off. The one way of exploring how we want to define our purpose personally and as investors is to answer the question, what kind of ancestor do you want to be? This was the title of a book I contributed a chapter to, in which all contributors answered the question posed in the title. So you might want to answer this for yourself. My answer was that I want to be the kind of ancestor that I look to in my ancestors. When I need a korowai, a cloak of strength, courage, and love to guide me. Perhaps in some sense, I will be a form of love, light, and frequency that comes as a presence. Another question posed was, how will I be remembered? And I answered a long time ago, my elders and mentors called for me to be a ruahine, someone who moves between worlds, to work between worlds, the spaces in between, to be comfortable with the known and the unknown, the seen and the unseen, the spiritual and the material. So I'd like to be remembered as a ruahine, explorer who went on inner and outer wayfinding journeys of discovery. So that's my personal example. And maybe at the end of this presentation, possibly with your ethical investment advisor, you could think about how you want to be remembered. What kind of ancestor do you want to be?
Thank you, Shelley. This deepening of the exploration of purpose adds value to the ethical investment process. Another related question is suggested by Stephen Covey, author of The 7 Habits of Highly Successful People, who proposed that in making plans, we begin with the end in mind. He encourages creating a life plan, starting by writing your obituary. What would you like others to say about you at your funeral? The answer to this and Shelley's questions can become the basis for the rest of your plan, providing a powerful statement of purpose, showing how we can more fully make sure our money matters. A further assistance with clarifying purpose and the bigger goals for the ethical investor's journey and how they can make their money matter are provided by the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, that offer a vision of shared prosperity in a sustainable world, a world where all people can live productive, vibrant, and peaceful lives on a healthy planet. The vision includes a target to limit climate change to 1.5 degrees of global warming above pre-industrial levels. Social challenges, such as those identified in the first 5 SDGs, include ending poverty and hunger, providing good health and well-being, quality education, and gender equality. Environmental challenges identified in the SDGs include climate action and affordable and clean energy, responsible consumption and production, life below water, and life on land. The SDGs provide a benchmark against which impact and progress can be measured, and that you as an ethical investor with your advisor and your fund manager can identify which SDGs you really want to focus on. As depicted in this diagram from the UN Principles for Responsible Investment, an international network of investors working together to implement responsible investment principles, for conventional investors, this question of purpose is answered solely in terms of financial returns. The conventional investor may simply not consider the environmental and social impact of their investment, or they might believe that doing so could increase their risk and/or reduce their return. For them, where their money is invested does not matter. They do not consider real-world impact. Whereas ethical investors add impact to the 2 dimensions of risk and return. This is a fundamental shift, journeying beyond the 2-dimensional business as usual world of solely risk and return. Instead, ethical investors are consciously choosing to embrace and explore a 3-dimensional approach, adding the consideration of an investment's impact on society and the environment to help us find our way to a more sustainable future. Simply put, the purpose of ethical investment is about making money and making a difference. The ethical investment journey involves a purpose that is wider, longer, and deeper than the approach of conventional investment and business. So that is purpose. Now let's look at our second P, principles. Ethical investors seek to invest in line with their principles or values And defining your principles is about defining what values and virtues will guide your journey.
From an Indigenous perspective, values are like stars, illuminating the human pathway, and Māori values are considered to be amongst the shining treasures of the culture. These principles are central to fulfilling the purpose of creating the 5 well-beings: economic, social, environmental, cultural, and spiritual well-being. So care, a virtue of ethical investors and ethical businesses, identified by Roger in his PhD, is also at the heart of the Māori value system. The principle of care calls upon humans to be kaitiaki, caretakers of the mauri, the spiritual life force that permeates all of creation, unifying all. For Māori, ora denotes well and in health. So the aim of caring is mauri ora, consciously created well-being. And Māori recognise that personal well-being is intimately linked to the well-being of others and of the environment. This sense of kinship with creation is a way of being and relating in a living web of interconnectedness. For the Wayfinder, the ethic of care extends to aroha, love. Putu explains love in a wayfinding context. He says, unless love is present in the way you operate, all the stuff is not ever going to be for a good reason. Aroha must be behind all these things that you do. Another key principle identified in Roger's research and in my research too is courage, which is a key principle for and a quality of the Wayfinder. From a Māori wayfinding perspective, this involves the courage to journey beyond the known. The ancient wayfinders who set off to lead the way to new worlds didn't let fear stop them journeying to new places. They went beyond the known, on voyages of discovery to new horizons. A key wayfinding mantra is, do not pray for fair weather, pray for courage. Wayfinder Papamo Piailog said, I have no fear when I'm at sea, because I have faith in the words of the ancestors. This faith is what we call courage. And with this courage, you can travel anywhere in the world and not get lost. Courage requires summoning inner strength to make the journey and stay on board during challenging and difficult times. The Wayfinder is often confronted with phenomena that can be both terrifying and magnificent. Storms, skyscraper waves, doldrums, maverick winds, and distorted frequencies can make conditions extremely difficult. The Wayfinder cannot be overcome by the enormity of the challenges that he or she faces, but must rise with courage to model the way and ensure the successful fulfillment of the purpose of the journey.
In my PhD, I explored the Aristotelian philosophy of virtue ethics, identifying caring and courage as principles that are central to ethical investment and ethical business. Applying an ethic of care involves a genuine concern and attention to the well-being of others and the environment. Bob Solomon, who is one of my mentors and author of Ethics and Excellence, explained that, quote, to care is to be willing to fight for, quote. There are degrees of care that can be seen in varying strength of commitment to ethical investment along a spectrum. Considered in the context of businesses in which ethical investors seek to invest, Solomon described how care is the glue of organizational life, an attitude that provides employees and all other stakeholders with a real sense of connection to and support from the business. This in turn provides a strong bond with the business and a reason for sticking with it. For Solomon and the Aristotelians, to care for someone ultimately means to help them grow and actualize themselves. This reflects the deeper dimension of ethical investment in business and ultimately the focus on becoming more enlightened, as Shelley has been describing. Now, this occurs alongside and in relationship with others, not just sitting in a remote hut meditating. Wayfinding provides unique guidance for this. An ethic of care can be contrasted with conventional investors who argue that investment and business ought to be amoral and not in any way seek to take account of what is right and wrong. For ethical investors, money can be an expression of love. We can move from the flatlands two-dimensional investment and business world, often characterized by money as motivated solely by the emotions of fear and greed, and stuck in that conventional box with a fixated consciousness. Liberating ourselves from this limited paradigm includes experiencing, expressing, and encouraging more love with our money in our life. It enables fulfillment of a life journey's purpose of making a positive impact. To quote the 1965 song, what the world needs now is love, not just for some, but for everyone. Taking the ethical investment journey also requires courage. Courage has been described as the essence of greatness and was the first virtue listed by Aristotle. This meant courage in combat, which can be equated to the courage displayed by ethical investors and businesses who refuse to accept that the only social responsibility of investors in business is profit maximization. So that is principles. Now let's look at practices, how we apply the wisdom through the actions an investor and business takes to fulfill purpose and principles. To be highly rated on the ethical spectrum, businesses need to implement particular practices. These can be considered by stakeholder group, such as environmental practices, for example, carbon efficiency, and employee practices, such as health and safety. But rather than listing and describing other examples of environmental and social practices, let's focus on the unique contribution that wayfinding offers to the practice of developing people. This is a practice described by research companies that rate the ethical performance of business and funds as, quote unquote, development of human capital. Shelley and I have both extensively studied this practice and trained businesses about the practice. And whilst it's a critical success factor, it's a practice that's not generally well understood by the investment community and investors. Shelley will now venture into giving you more insight into applying this deeper view, exploring some wayfinding leadership practices to support you in being a leader, personally, professionally, and as an investor.
Western navigation typically involves trying to take the most direct route possible, relying heavily on maps, sextant, and compass to make landfall. While maps and charts can be extremely helpful, when we stop being open to new ways of seeing things, we may come to rely on our abstractions rather than on reality itself. We can suffer paradigm paralysis, thinking within the square of our paradigm box. In investment terms, this can be equated to the conventional investor stuck in the box of two-dimensional thinking of only considering risk and return and unable to really engage with the paradigm shift to a three-dimensional approach. Wayfinding works by recognizing and responding to what is happening as it unfolds. The power of wayfinding is that it synthesizes many intelligences, not just rational abstract knowledge. Sphere intelligence is what predominates. So we can relate this to a three-dimensional investment perspective. By being fully involved and perceptive, the wayfinder responds with direct participation, not from a detached distance. The skills of the wayfinder call for a deep appreciation of and attendance to intuition and nuance. In doing so, the wayfinder sees things that others may not. I was introduced to the concept of calling the island to you by Professor Charles Royal, who explained that for the purposes of navigation, the Polynesian wayfinder would conceive of the waka as stationary whilst the world slid past, much as a train passenger looking through a carriage window sees the world moving. By staying still, wayfinders align to the star path at night and adjust to the ocean swell by day. Steering is done through sensation as well as sight, and they gain important information from the telltale cloud formations that develop over high islands and over coral atolls, and note their colour. Islands with heavy vegetation produce a dark tinge, and those with white sand give a brighter sheen. They also observe the frequencies of the ocean swells that can help identify land as far as 90 kilometres away, and the flight paths of homing birds that return to land at night. Such navigation is not just about the stars, sun, clouds, swells, or the wind. It's based on a deep understanding of the relationships between them. As the world continues to move past, the walker's destination eventually appears on the horizon. The wayfinder continues to adjust to signs and possibly even changing direction in a dog-leg fashion. The task of the wayfinder is to stay in communion with the unfolding processes of the surrounding world, and by moving from stillness, bringing the island to them through becoming. Not long after hearing this explanation, I shared it with a colleague who told me the contrasting story of the steam corvette HMS Orpheus, which highlighted, amongst other lessons, the folly of being too focused on a particular plan or chart. The captain of the Orpheus had access to 2 charts of the treacherous entrance to New Zealand's Manukau Harbour, one from 1856, which was ratified but out of date, and the other, a revised pilotage guide from 1861, which showed that a sandbar had altered considerably. As the vessel approached the harbour under clear skies on 7th of February 1863, it needed to navigate the series of dangerous sandbars. The captain ignored signals from onshore and on the boat and insisted on being guided by his ratified but outdated chart. The vessel hit the sandbar and swung around, exposing the port side to the pounding surf. HMS Orpheus sank, becoming the worst maritime disaster in New Zealand waters. Of 259 people on board, 189 died. All cultures have their tales of such disasters. The story of HMS Orpheus highlights the terrible consequences of a leader or investor not reading the signs and instead being fixated on an outdated map. So investors need to be alert to the potential for such disasters. And there are many environmental and social disasters caused by unethical businesses. And these also often create a huge financial disaster too. By taking a 3-dimensional impact-based view with dynamic planning and course correcting, investors are much better placed to find their way through the sandbars and limitations of conventional investment in business as usual. But to acquire the wise perspective of the wayfinder, including mental resilience, courage, and resolve, is to operate from a relaxed state in all circumstances, whether in the midst of a raging storm or caught up in the unpredictable and dangerous winds of the doldrums. Master wayfinders have the ability to move from stillness. They possess a steadfast, calm clarity. And this can also be invaluable for investors. Paradoxically, when the going gets tough, the tough get relaxed. When we relax, we are more likely to find a creative solution. Leaders and investors who operate from a base of stillness and presence that is very grounded can see better what's going on and respond appropriately. It's essential on board the Waka that everyone acts from grounded stillness, not from reactivity, agitation, distraction, or being fixated. So the invitation is to aim to cultivate this purposeful and active stillness. Central to wayfinding is the discipline of reading the signs in an unfolding, constantly moving reality, one in which the wayfinder stays open and responsive to changing conditions. The wayfinder's aim is to recognize what is really going on. This might sound simple enough, however, to recognize is to see deeply into reality from within, not from an abstract and theoretical distance. Sphere intelligence involves the direct perception of reality, and this occurs by being involved in the world, immersed within it, and reading constantly changing signals. Putu explains that by tapping into many intelligences and ways of knowing, and staying continuously open to possibilities, wayfinders are constantly refreshing their understanding. Sphere intelligence allows the infusion of reality to permeate us. This process looks to the whole as well as the detail. It's a process of making interconnections and seeing relationships to the whole, not just the bits of data, through integrating systems and relationships.
Having discussed purpose, principles, and practices, the fourth and final step in the 4Ps model is to address performance measurement. This can be considered at various levels, from your plan through to your portfolio, from financial returns through to measures of impact.
So a wayfinding approach doesn't have to fall into the trap of setting the analytical and intuitive approaches in opposition to one another, but seeks to integrate and balance both. Accordingly, leaders and investors need to be wary of over-reliance on data, which can be quantified and reduced to pure numeric value. The wayfinding approach is both and, rather than either or. It takes the best of leadership and investment theory and practice to another level of effectiveness.
Performance measurement, as wayfinding highlights, ought to include quantitative and qualitative company data and stakeholder perceptions, and a lot more besides. This is a big subject in itself that I started researching back in 1983 for a special project as part of an accounting degree. So I'll simply note for now that at the opposite end of the greenwashing spectrum that financial regulators globally are now seeking to address are today's leading fund managers who are wayfinding exemplars, pioneering new impact performance measurement and reporting. You can see examples of these on the Co-op website and in the Greenleaf rating system, in which members of the Co-op rate the ethical performance of funds from excellent to poor. Some of the funds rated highest offer a feature many ethical investors enjoy when fund managers offer an impact calculator. I sit down with clients and find that when they can enter the amount of their investment and see the actual impact in terms of factors such as renewable energy generated, tons of waste recycled, tons of CO2 emissions avoided, litres of water not used, wastewater treated, people receiving healthcare, and in the last year, COVID tests produced, it really does inspire those investors. Gives them a sense of the real impact that they're making. The Co-op's website for Ethical Investment Week has some recent videos that show this in more detail, including from a UK-based fund manager that has specifically created a video for Ethical Investment Week with the wayfinding theme, and they've showed how they measure and report impact in this way. These new performance measurement developments are most encouraging. They indicate that leading ethical fund managers are increasingly more effectively measuring impact and reflecting the wider stakeholder and longer intergenerational views. A future frontier might be for those fund managers to explore the deeper view by calling for the companies in which they invest to undertake more in-depth leadership development, such as wayfinding leadership, and for those journeys of growth to be measured and reported. So having considered the 4Ps, our finale and the next step is, if you haven't already done so, to, of course, find yourself an astute navigator in the form of a specialist ethical investment advisor. As we've discussed, the advisor can help you to clarify your purpose, including setting clear, realistic goals for your future lifestyle, legacy, and other objectives, and how you want that money to matter in terms of environmental and social impact. Principles for your portfolio. Tonight, we've looked at examples of care and courage. Practices for success of the investment journey, taking account of your risk profile, what degree of bad weather you're willing to tolerate along the way, and ethical investment profile, and bring that all together in an investment plan and a recommended ethical investment portfolio that the navigator has built as a sturdy vessel to help you achieve your goals and withstand conditions at sea. Expert navigational skills applied by your advisor will also include performance measurement at 4th P, tracking progress, reading the signs along the way, and course correcting as required. Wise sailors and investors know that the map is not the territory. And once you set sail, change will be the only constant, as the tides, currents, and winds will mean that you won't travel in a straight line. It will seem that you're being blown off course. It can also be tempting to succumb to distractions along the way. Your navigator can help you apply best practices, including avoiding succumbing to those emotions of fear and greed and distractions that can undermine your plan and potentially sink your ship. Ethical investment advisors and our clients and the ethical funds in which we invest are wayfinders, transforming the finance system and financing the transformation needed for a sustainable future. We're aiming higher, to reduce environmental, social and financial risks and increase financial return by creating more positive environmental and social impact. Shelley and I wish you all the very best for your wayfinding journey of really making your money matter. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that presentation, Shelley and Roger. I found myself so very moved by what you were saying at an emotional level that I didn't expect when we started at this. So Shelley, I'd like to ask you a first question, but I'd like to also remind our participants tonight that they can pop their own questions to you into the chat function, which is sort of at the lower right-hand side of the window. Shelley and Roger have generously offered to answer everybody's answer questions, and I do encourage you for that. But Shelley, I'd like to start off by just asking you, if you're someone like me who's at the beginning stages of exploring Indigenous wisdom and their own ancestry, can you give us some further guidance as to how they might be able to do that?
Oh, thanks, Rachel. That's a lovely question. And again, apologies that you can't see us, everybody. We've lost our video capacity, but hey, work out for good reasons. Well, I remember some years ago, we did a workshop in the middle of London in an industrial estate. There were about 30 people gathered together in the Skip Gardens, which was a regenerative, sustainable garden in the middle of this estate. And we started with a circle. We were about 30 people, physicists, teachers, counsellors, all people from all walks of life. And we introduced ourselves fulsomely using what in Māori we call a mihi and a pepeha. So we introduce ourselves in relation to the places that we belong to, the communities that we descend from. And it was so moving and so deep, and people were crying. And just in that really simple process of showing up whole in who we really are. And after that, some months later, I got an email from the organisers of the workshop, and they said that people had gone off on all these different journeys. Someone had gone back to Eritrea in search of their ancestry. Some people going up on the coast looking into their Celtic origins. We had a Huguenot. So I think the thing is, Rachel, is to start going on that journey of discovery into our ancestors and go into these places that hold our memory, our collective memory.
I found myself so moved as well by the question of what kind of ancestor do you want to be? I think I'm going to go away and think on that as much as anything else after tonight, and think about how that would apply towards practices, professional practices, investment related. So I thank you for that as well. Shelley, to go further on that journey, what are your key challenges and invitations for leaders and investors and the people that have joined us on this conversation tonight?
Well, yes, I guess something that's often in the fringes of the conversation is spirituality, what Māori we call wairua. And to put that at the centre, I think the crisis of sustainability is also a crisis of spirituality. And that if we really start to open ourselves to this intimate relationship with the world and deep fondness, and I talked about or that coalescence of connectedness, that when we really see ourselves in kinship with all of creation, it really shifts perspective and takes us into that spheres world. So I think the crisis is one of spirituality as well, when we reconnect with this planet, with this earth, with nature, with each other in deeper, more intimate ways.
And Roger, if I could bring you in on a conversational point here as well. I'd like to ask you, in terms of actual investment practice, how would this integration of wairua, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, be expressed as someone who's an ethical advisor to clients?
Well, fundamentally, the framework of considering purpose, like what's the meaning of life, it's a pretty core kind of spiritual question. And a lot of those traditions, like the quote we had from Parker Palmer of the Courage to Lead author, talk about this idea of sort of exploring meaning and purpose and looking to become people who are making a greater contribution in our lives. And of course, the ethical investment and how we direct our money is fundamental to how we can do that. But as ethical investment advisors, we can really sort of open up the conversation to explore that obituary question, explore that, what sort of ancestor do I want to be? And then thinking about, well, how can we structure our lives and as clients to have our money matter and support us in those various capacities. And even thinking about those principles and how they'll guide us, where do we sit in relation to those values like caring and courage? And what are the practices that we apply, and what's the performance measurement that we can consider? And in a sort of spiritual context, it sounds a bit strange, but when I did my accounting degree back in the day, and even the PhD, there was a lot of discussion about how business people would really only use a term like love in the context of their football team or favorite food. But in essence, that there's an ability to account for love, and there's an ability to see, if you like, in a spiritual context, this idea that we can be more loving and we can make more of a difference in that way. And I think for many spiritual traditions, that is the essence of it, and how we direct our money matters a great deal in that regard.
I think, what is it? Was it the government of Bhutan that had the measurement of gross happiness index or gross happiness product as part of their government calculation of wellness and well-being of their people? And I always loved that as a concept. Roger, can you, turning a bit maybe towards the practical, to chase up on something that you brought up towards the end of the presentation, can you give us some practical examples of how fund managers are leading the way on impact reporting? And maybe to push it a little bit further, if fund managers were to take in this, this coalescence of spirituality, this wadua, how might they further communicate and center their investment towards their clients?
I think it's fascinating to look at the spectrum of ethical investment, which sort of starts off with this idea of ESG, or environmental, social, and governance integration, and then moves along a spectrum of sustainability and increasing impact. And there's a lovely diagram about that in the Sustainable Finance Forum report, and the Co-op and the Money Matters website refer to that as well. So at the high impact end of the spectrum, we've got the fund managers who aren't simply thinking about measurement in terms of ESG, although that's important, but they're really thinking about the positive impact of the products and services that the businesses they're investing in are producing. They're looking for businesses that define their very purpose, their reason for being, as making a strong impact. And there are a range of really interesting frameworks. One manager asks 5 key questions. They say, who is the client that the business is serving, and how vulnerable is that client? How critical is the impact of what's being produced to the client's future fitness? How central is the product or service in delivering the impact? How large is the positive impact? And how unique is the company's contribution? So that involves quantitative and qualitative data, covers environmental and social themes, and together it brings up what they describe as an overall impact intensity score. And then alongside that, they have an assessment where they look at the fundamental quality of the business. So they look at financial and ESG analysis. They look at market position, governance, supply chain, environmental risks, ethics, and engagement response. And then they bring it all together in a fascinating impact map where they plot an overall score based on, on one hand, that impact intensity, the other hand, that fundamental quality. And what they're aiming for is businesses that are really making a big contribution to those sustainable development goals, and they're wanting to continually graduate the portfolio into more intensely impactful companies with higher quality. And over time, they talk about moving to the upper right quadrant of the impact map. So that's high impact intensity and high quality. And each year they discuss the results in their impact report, including talking about companies with low impact scores and how that was an important part of the decision to sell companies. So for me, this is a very applied example of that, highfalutin spiritual purpose stuff. We're down on the ground and we're saying, here's a world with massive environmental and social problems. We need businesses that are addressing those problems, and we need investors that are providing the investment to support that.
Thank you. I think that unless anybody has any questions they'd like to pop into the chat right now, I think I'd like to finish this up and pass this over to Sarah. But to say, again, thank you. I think I'll be focusing on how I explore this sector with love and with empathy and with an eye towards the sort of ancestor I'd like to be. So Roger and Shelley, thank you so much. Sarah, back to you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. And thank you, Dr. Roger Spiller, Professor Shelley Spiller, and Rachel from FS Sustainability. What a fantastic session. I agree with Rachel. I actually was found it unexpected anyway, the emotional response and just the way Shelley's, your research just gives such a unique perspective to ethical investing. So I'm sure all the participants have gained a lot from today's session. So I do want to thank everyone who has attended online, and also for the audience that I have here who are watching it live. And so for those who want further information, they can visit the Ethical Advisors Co-op webpage. And for those of you who have attended online, you will be forwarded a copy of today's presentation. And Rachel will also be doing an article following this event, and we'll make sure we get a copy of that to all of you as well. So from me and from the Ethical Advisors Co-op, thank you all for joining, and I hope you have a good night.